Wrestling has always been a superhero story in many ways. After all, it's a tale of heroes fighting villains, all while fans cheer on the good guys and hope they come out victorious. Hell, by the time the 80s rolled around and Vince McMahon took over the industry, the whole thing had even become as colorful as a live-action comic book. That said, there have been several actual masked crusader gimmicks throughout history. But what are the most notable of them all? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. So join us as we take a deep dive into, up and at them, wrestling superhero gimmicks. And if we're going to start anywhere with this one, we really should do so with perhaps the most famous of all wrestling superheroes, and that's none other than the Hurricane. Yes, he may have started out his career in the Carolinas as Gregory Helms, and he may have first made a name for himself in WCW as cruiserweight star Sugar Shane, but it wasn't until the Smithfield native made his way over to WWE during the ill-fated Invasion angle that he really found his groove with a character which would make his entire career. What was this character? Well, unsurprisingly, given the topic of this video, it was a wrestling superhero, one named the Hurricane, on account of his ability to swoosh in at a moment's notice and battle any injustice he saw taking place. Sure, it was all quite comedic, and it was played that way on screen, with the Hurricane usually serving as a figure that could get a few laughs during backstage segments. But this didn't mean he wasn't serious once he actually hit the ring. No, keen to remind everyone that he was still one of the best cruiserweights in the world, Helms always brought it once the bell rang, with this being enough to see him win the cruiserweight title on 2 separate occasions, as well as the hardcore and European belts 1 time each respectively. Still though, for as much as he could go, it was always the character itself and his comedic side which people enjoyed the most about this one. And it wasn't just audiences who got into it either. No, even other wrestlers were taken by what the Carolinian was doing. And that's exactly why in 2003, The Rock himself got into a TV program with the superhero star, something which must surely rank as a career highlight for him to this day. But alas, not long after this, the Hurricane ended up being retired for a while after Helms felt the gimmick had run its course, and so from there, he'd be forced to try and revive himself under a new, more serious character. Not that this would mark the end of everyone's favorite crime fighter forever though. No? Like any good superhero, he rose from the dead in 2008 once more, and there had a second run which saw him prove that the idea still had legs left in it after all those years. Even to this day, in fact, the Hurricane will still make the odd appearance at an indie show or in a WWE or AEW cameo. But it should never go forgotten he likely wouldn't have been able to reach such a point of success had it not been for the crew he built around him over the years, with perhaps the most notable of these being Rosie. Yes, any good hero needs a sidekick. After all, Batman has Robin, Superman has Jimmy Olsen, and Captain America has Bucky Barnes. So when the Hurricane started picking up steam in the early 2000s then, it was clear that he was going to need his own apprentice, with this eventually coming in the form of a certain NOIE family member. Of course, such a gimmick wasn't Rosie's first go-around in WWE though. No, prior to this, he made something of a splash as a member of 3 Minute Warning. But for as much as this put him on the map, it was his next move which really made him, as at this point, he decided what he really wanted was to be an SHIT, or superhero in training. So taking his new duties seriously then, he began getting involved in numerous pre-taped segments with Gregory Helms, doing things like helping old ladies cross the street and attempting to get changed into his costume in a phone box. Sure, it was all pretty silly and a far cry from the serious threat the San Francisco native had been presented as prior, but it was undeniably fun anyway. And fans at the time agreed with this sentiment too, so much so that pretty soon, the Hurricane and Rosie were a full-time tag team, with them even at one point winning the World Tag Team titles together after defeating La Resistance for the honor at May 2005's Backlash pay-per-view. Unfortunately though, like with the Hurricane's first run, all good things can't last forever, and eventually after losing their belts to Lance Cade and Trevor Murdoch, signs of dissension began to rear their ugly head amongst the crime-fighting duo. But while most people expected it to be Rosie who turned here, in the end, it was his partner who attacked him in frustration, and soon thereafter, formally severing the team in the process and ending the big man's brief run as part of WWE's very own Justice League. It's just as well Rosie wasn't the only apprentice Gregory Helms had over the course of his run then. No, there were actually 2 more as it happened. And one of these actually predates the crime-fighting tag team champions because it was back in 2001 that Mighty Molly first made an appearance on the scene. Who was Mighty Molly? Well, it was seasoned women's wrestler Molly Holly under a mask. That's right, while she's often been criticized for not having enough character, the Minnesota native proved this assumption to be false back at the turn of the millennium when she began suiting up to take on all the evils of the world herself. Sure, like with Rosie, this wasn't Molly's first gimmick in New York, as prior to that, she had a notable run with her on-screen cousins Bob and Crash Holly. But while this did get her over to a certain extent, things really took off once she moved on to the next phase of her career. And as we mentioned a moment ago, that phase meant donning her very own superhero costume and pairing herself up with the Hurricane as his brand new sidekick. No, the duo didn't actually wrestle together, as mixed tags were a rarity in WWE at this time, but like any true partners, they were always to be found on screen together, ready to back each other up whenever need be. That was until WrestleMania 18, of course, as it was then that, feeling the pull to stretch her wings and go solo, Mighty Molly turned on her master when she hit him with a frying pan during a backstage segment, then pinned him to become the new Hardcore Champion. Was this a betrayal on the level of Scarlet Witch disassembling the Avengers? Not quite, but it did mean the end of the partnership between the pair. And as if that weren't bad enough, in true Hardcore Champion fashion, Molly ended up losing her title only 1 hour later when the antagonist to Children with Dead Fathers Everywhere, Christian, slammed a door in her face and pinned her. So realizing the solo superhero act wasn't going to work out the way she'd hoped, pretty quickly after this, the now former Hardcore Champion returned to her old name and started a new run as a top heel of the women's divisions. And one of the women she would face off against during this period ended up being the final protege of the Hurricane as it happened, though in the case of Super Stacy, this wouldn't occur until a few years later in 2005. Yes, it was in the middle of the decade, right as Gregory Helm's alter ego was riding high with Rosie as his partner, that Stacy Keibler, fresh off a run as Randy Orton's on-screen girlfriend, decided she wanted to try out this whole crime-fighting thing for herself too. And that's what led to her donning her own superhero costume then, as she became the third part of what was now a trio of do-gooders. Sure, like Mighty Molly, Stacy never actually wrestled alongside her stablemates, but she did always make sure to stand in their corner during their tag team title defenses. And when she wasn't doing this, she was serving as the women's division's resident hero when she got involved in singles bouts there against the likes of Victoria, Gail Kim, and Trish Stratus. Did such bouts end up bringing her anything in the way of title success? No, but any good superhero knows it's not about the rewards anyway. Rather, it's about the satisfaction of having done the right thing. So Super Stacy never lamented this then, and always kept fighting the good fight regardless, something which meant fans remained behind her no matter what. Sadly though, in the end, her run as a crime fighter proved to be short-lived too. Not because Stacy had a falling out with her partners, of course, but because in August of that year, as part of the annual WWE draft, she was shifted over to SmackDown, with this meaning the three would no longer be on the same brand going forward. And sure, if she really wanted to, the Maryland native could have just kept on going with her superhero act as a solo gimmick at this point, but instead, she took it as an opportunity to have a clean break and refresh herself as she reverted back to regular old Stacy Keibler, something she maintained all the way up until she left the company altogether a year later. Yes, it seems like female crime fighters in WWE don't always have a lengthy shelf life, which is a crying shame in many ways. That said, there is one who, while not exactly long-lasting either, did do a fair bit with her time under the mask in 2021. Hell, she even briefly won the Raw Women's title. Who are we talking about here? Why, Nikki Ash, of course. That's right, while her early career might have been better characterized by her being the best in the galaxy over on the Scottish independent scene, or her serving as the resident psychopath of sanity on NXT, come the turn of the decade, the Scottish-born star decided she needed to make a change if she wanted to reach that next level. And this meant playing into a real-life character a little more than someone who was less of a crazy lunatic and more of an all-around nice person who just wanted to help others out. How would such a character represent itself on screen? Well, in the form of Nikki Ash, or almost a superhero. Basically, the idea here was that Nikki wasn't quite superheroic in her abilities, but she was always trying her hardest to get there, a distinction she hoped would endear her towards audiences better, as it felt a little more realistic that she wasn't some perfect bastion of goodness. Sure, some thought the idea of presenting her as not quite being good enough to qualify as a hero was a little lame, and cut the legs out from under her before she could even get started, but Nikki seemed happy with the gimmick regardless. And using it for all she could then, she was able to rise up the ranks of the women's singles division over on Raw throughout that year, with her eventually not only earning a spot in the women's Money in the Bank ladder match in July, but also going on to win the whole thing. And with the briefcase now in her possession, it didn't take the Scotswoman long to cash this in, as the very next night she'd insert herself into a bout with Charlotte Flair, and in short order, become the Raw Women's Champion. That said, she would end up losing this belt back to the Queen the following month, meaning her run was ultimately short. But then for someone who is only almost a superhero, perhaps that was a fitting way for things to go. And perhaps it's also fitting that she's since hung up her cape and allowed others to take up the mantle of crime fighter if and when they choose to do so, because upon Triple H taking over as head of creative in the summer of 2022, Nikki decided to revert back to being just plain old Nikki Cross. Who will be the next one to carry on the legacy of the gimmick? That remains to be seen. But whoever they are, one thing we can say for sure is that it won't be Hulk Hogan, as despite all the rumors which have circulated throughout the years, he was never in fact the man under the Mr. America mask. Yes, you've all no doubt seen the clip which purports to show Mr. America lift up his mask and reveal a certain blonde handlebar mustachioed figure underneath, but we all know that CGI can be a powerful tool in making things that aren't real look real in this day and age, so we're not buying it for a second. So who was this mysterious patriot then? Well, while we may never know the answer to that question, what we can say for sure is that for a period over on early 2000s SmackDown, he was the bane of Vince McMahon's existence. But then why wouldn't he be? Because if wrestling ever had a supervillain both on screen and in real life, its very own Lex Luthor, then it would be the boss himself. And after banishing Terry Bollea from WWE following the events of WrestleMania 19, he was riding high and in serious need of someone to bring him down a peg or two. Enter Mr. America, a man who, for some deranged reason, Vince came to believe was Hogan under a mask. But while he clearly wasn't, it didn't mean the superhero didn't have a bone to pick with his employer anyway, and so that was why the two feuded during the months which followed, with this feud at point bringing other names into its orbit too, such as Rowdy Roddy Piper, Brock Lesnar, and Zach Gowen. Hell, it would even give us one of the best segments of the era when Vince demanded Mr. America take a lie detector test to prove he wasn't the Hulkster, only for the babyface to pass this with flying colors, brother. That said, soon after, he would end up gone from the company anyway when the aforementioned footage of him supposedly revealing his identity was discovered by Vince McMahon, and as a result, he was fired from his position both on screen and off. Still though, even if it looks unlikely this particular crime fighter will ever return to the ring again, he still lives on fondly in the people's memory. Of course, he's not as fondly remembered as our next subject, however, but then few are as beloved as Owen Hart and his alter ego of the Blue Blazer. And while this one ended in real-life tragedy when Owen fell from the rafters at May 23, 1999's Over the Edge pay-per-view and subsequently died, there was so much more to the King of Hearts' career than his final night on Earth. And a large part of this was his time as the Blue Blazer, because he'd actually first played the character years before in 1988 and 1999 during his first run in New York. Of course, back then it was very much an undercard gimmick, one designed to try and highlight the youngest Hart's innovative high-flying style, but it got over well regardless, and even saw him make appearances at such shows as Survivor Series 1998 and WrestleMania 5, the latter of which featured Owen in a one-on-one bout with Mr. Perfect. That said, come the turn of the decade, the Blue Blazers' time would be over, and so after taking a brief detour to places such as Japan, the Calgary native returned to the WWF in 1991 under his real name, where he'd go on to have a career best run when he eventually began a feud with his brother Bret over the world title. And things continued to go strong for Owen even after this was over, as at that point, he'd become a member of the reformed Hart Foundation and get involved in the hottest angle of 1997 in WWF, the America vs. Canada War. Once that was done, however, things stalled somewhat, and so that was why at a certain point, it was floated to the Canadian that he revived the Blue Blazer gimmick, this time as a bumbling comedy character. But while this was entertaining for some for a little while, it saw Owen desperately try to pretend he wasn't the man behind the mask. It was far beneath what he was capable of by now, and so felt very much like a waste of time. Then of course, there was the way things ended on that fateful night in Kansas City, an incident which would have never occurred if he wasn't playing the superhero character. Really, it still hurts to think about it to this day. But even if his life was cut short, at least Owen Hart will always be remembered as one of the greatest of all time, no matter how bad of a character he had to go out with. The same of which can't be said for our next subject, Brad Armstrong, and his infamous gimmick of Arachnaman. Yeah, there's a reason people talk about the Armstrong family curse, and things like this certainly don't help, because it was in 1991 that Brad, son of Bullet Bob and brother of Road Dogg, found himself with an all-time bad gimmick, one which purported to be a superhero. What superhero was this? Why, Arachnaman, of course, a spider-themed crime fighter who wore an ill-fitting and very garish yellow and purple web-covered costume to the ring for his matches. Of course, you don't win any prize for realizing that such a gimmick was suspiciously similar to another famous comic book character out there, one who had a history of fighting foes like Doc Ock, Venom, and the Green Goblin. That's right, this one was basically a straight-up ripoff of Spider-Man. Hell, it's not as if WCW were even being subtle about it. And it's not like they'd picked some unknown hero to ape either, and the chances it wouldn't get noticed, because outside of Batman and Superman, Peter Parker was pretty much the most famous costume crime fighter out there. Still, feeling like they could get away with it, the Southern Wrestling promotion decided to push on with the idea anyway, with this leading to Armstrong having the unfortunate distinction of being forced to come out to the ring in the infamous getup during a show in the latter part of the year to take on Mike Rotunda in one-on-one action. How would such a bout go? Pretty badly as it turned out, because if fans weren't already turned off by the whole thing as soon as Arachnaman came through the curtain, they certainly were when he was billed as hailing from Web City, something even Jim Ross couldn't get over on commentary. And to make matters worse, once Marvel Comics learned that such a thing was taking place, they immediately got their lawyers involved, meaning this would represent the one and only television appearance of the web-based fighter. But it's not just WCW and WWE who have dipped their toes into the water of superhero-based gimmicks over the years. No, Impact has also tried out their hands at it as well. And the best example of them doing this came in 2008, when perennial underdog Eric Young decided to transform himself into Super Eric for a little while. But how did such a thing happen? Well, in the early months of that year, after losing a beer drinking championship match against James Storm, Young decided to switch things up just in time for his subsequent bout at March 9th's Destination X, where while teaming with Frankie Kazarian to take on Black Reign and Relic, he'd debut a new alter ego named Super Eric. And this alter ego proved to be quite a success for him in the short term at least, because upon winning the bout, he and Kaz continued partnering up, with their subsequent victories eventually landing them the #1 contendership spot to the TNA World Tag Team titles. Unfortunately though, after winning those very belts on the April 17th episode of Impact, it would be Young's secret identity which led to his downfall, as after admitting both he and Super Eric were one and the same, TNA bosses decided to strip him of his title, as he had lied to them about who was taking part in the match. Was all this a bit silly, even by wrestling standards? Sure. But when you're dealing with Eric Young, things are always going to lean a little more towards the comedic side of things. And it wasn't like this marked the end of the Super Eric gimmick forever, because after finding a new partner in AJ Styles and then going on to win the tag team titles with him, the Canadian briefly retired and then revived the character in July of 2007 when he entered into TNA's own version of the Justice League, named the Prince Justice Brotherhood, alongside Shark Boy and Curry Man. That said, following this, Super Eric would disappear from TV again, with him yet to return as of the time of this video's recording. Does this mean we'll never see him fend off the wrongdoers of Impact at any point in the future? Well, that remains to be seen. What we can say for sure, though, is that during the time he was around, Young's crime-fighting persona was able to leave an impact big enough that he's still remembered to this day. But then we can say the same about everyone we've discussed today, because collectively, they all represent the truly superheroic side of the industry, and Avengers for the squared circle, if there ever was one.